Okay, so today we're going to be taking a look at how to do a close reading of a passage. We're going to be doing close readings quite a bit to prep for our literature circles, so it's important that you understand the steps that you need to do as you're doing your close readings. So for today, we're going to be taking a look at just one paragraph from our short story, What of This Goldfish Would You Wish? And our step number one is just to reread whatever passage it is that we're going to be taking a close read at. So we're only going to be looking at this first paragraph of this page. So I'm going to go ahead and read it. And as I'm reading, what I should be doing is looking for lines that stand out to me or for words or phrases that I don't understand that I want to define later. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Sergei Gorelik doesn't much like strangers banging on his door, especially when those strangers are asking him questions. In Russia, when Sergei was young, it happened plenty. The KGB felt right at home knocking on his door. His father had been a Zionist, which was pretty much an invitation for them to drop by any old time. Okay, so there are a couple of things that stand out to me. The first thing that stands out to me are these two terms here, KGB and Zionist. So when we're finding terms that we don't understand entirely, what we want to do is highlight them and then define them in our annotations. So I know that the KGB is like the Russian secret police. So I'm going to make that annotation here so that as I read this passage, if I need to get a little bit of clarification, I'll have my annotation right there. And remember that whenever we do an annotation in our MyHRW, we need to make sure to check this box before we save. Okay, so that's our first little annotation. The KGB is like the Russian secret police. That much we know. And this note is going to live over here on the side for us to come back to later. The second term that I feel like probably needs to be defined is this one down here, Zionist. But I do notice that this one actually has a note to help us out with what this word means. So according to this note, a Zionist is a supporter of a separate state for Jewish people. Okay, that makes sense. I think I'll go ahead and add the annotation anyway, just because I feel like I might really need to know what this word means. So here we know that a Zionist means that you support a separate Jewish nation. And we know that Israel is a separate Jewish nation, so this would be something like Israel. So his father is a supporter of Israel. Okay, that's good to know. That makes things a little bit clearer. The other thing that really popped out to me when I was reading this passage was this line here, especially when those strangers are asking him questions. I just feel like this line tells us a lot about Sergei, and it also pops out to me because I don't think that this sentence is complete. So I'm just going to go ahead and say, it seems like Sergei is paranoid. He doesn't like strangers, which seems important because we know that Yoni is a stranger who is currently looking for other strangers to ask them questions. So this already sort of creates a difference from Yoni. So unlike Yoni, who is on a mission to talk to as many people as possible. And remember that when we're doing our annotations, it doesn't matter if we're writing incomplete sentences or that our writing is beautiful. We just want to make sure we're getting our thoughts down. Okay, so that line stands out to us. So once we've done our initial reading of a passage and we've asked sort of what are the words that we might have difficulties with and what are the lines that stand out to us, the second thing that we're going to do is we're going to go line by line through our text. And as we're going line by line, what we're looking for are things like patterns, so how sentences are formed, figurative language, so any sort of similes or metaphors or allusions that are in the text, and really anything that stands out to us as part of the author's style. So looking for things that sort of mark this paragraph as part of the author's style. So let's go ahead and look at this first sentence. Sergei Gorelik doesn't much like strangers banging on his door. Okay, so this sentence, even though it seems very simple on the outset, actually is doing quite a bit because I know in the context of the larger story that this is the first time that we meet Sergei. This is the first sentence that this character appears. And I also remember that when I read this the first time, this appearance from Sergei seemed very sudden. It almost took me a minute to realize that we had suddenly switched perspective. So I might make a note right here that this is a sudden switch into Sergei's perspective or point of view from Yoni's. It's very sudden. It happens so quickly. It actually reminds me a lot of someone banging on a door, which is kind of interesting. So Sergei Gorelik doesn't much like strangers banging on his door. Well, the way that Sergei's perspective kind of comes at us almost feels like banging on a door. I wonder if there's something we can make about that. The other thing that's popping out to me here in this sentence is this idea of a stranger, because we as the readers who have already been introduced to Yoni and who know that he's making this documentary, well, we know it's not a stranger banging on the door. The stranger is Yoni. And we're learning just in this sentence that Sergei doesn't much like strangers. So it sounds like Sergei isn't much going to like Yoni, which is interesting. So my annotation for this might sound something like the stranger is actually Yoni. So Sergei doesn't like Yoni from the first second. They meet. Now, knowing what we know about how these people's interaction goes, that seems kind of important. That even from the outset, Sergei is predispositioned not to like Yoni very much. Okay, that seems like that's a pretty good takedown of that sentence. Let's check out the next one. Especially when those strangers are asking him questions. Okay, so this is the sentence that we highlighted earlier. And I remember when this sentence came up that it stood out to me, number one, because Sergei was paranoid, and it gave us that impression. But the second reason why this stood out to me is that this is an incomplete sentence. It's not grammatically correct. There's no person doing something in this sentence, and that means that this sentence really should actually be connected to the one before. I didn't notice any other grammatically incorrect sentences in this passage, so this seems to be an intentional choice on the part of the author. Okay, I definitely want to come back to this later as I'm asking questions. For right now, I'm just going to note that this is an incomplete sentence and that seems kind of weird. Okay, let's check out the next one. In Russia, when Sergei was young, it happened plenty. Okay, so we know that Sergei is from Russia, which means that he is an immigrant to Israel. And we know that when he was young, a lot of people knocked on his door. Okay, so we're getting a little bit about his background here. This might come back to be important later on. Let's check out the next one. The KGB, or secret police, felt right at home knocking on his door. Now that's interesting. So, the KGB felt right at home knocking on his door. So for him, it sounds like whenever there's a knock on his door, it's related in his mind to the KGB, which, if they're a secret police, that seems like this would be really dangerous. So he has this history of dangerous people knocking on his door, which explains a lot of his paranoia. Okay, that's interesting. Let's read this last sentence. His father had been a Zionist, or a supporter of Israel, which was pretty much an invitation for them to drop by any old time. Okay, so I think I am going to add a note here. I think what's important about these sentences is that we're getting the background, right? So we're learning a cultural background specifically. For Sergei is that he's Russian and he has a history of dangerous people knocking on his door. Therefore, we might make the interpretation that his paranoia is justified. It makes sense that he's paranoid given the context of his background. So if he's getting upset with Yoni, in his background, given that when he's gotten knocks before from the KGB, That seems like it might be rational. Okay, so that's pretty good. Just by rereading this sentence by sentence, we've already gotten a lot more notes to work with. So once we've gone through and we've read the passage originally, and now we've gone line by line, the next thing that we want to start to do is asking questions about what we've noticed. So let's go ahead and open up some of our notes and see if there's any questions we want to ask about them. So our first note was on this switch right here into Sergei's point of view. And when we're thinking about questions, we want to be thinking why and how. So why was there this sudden switch into Sergei's point of view? What is there about being inside of Sergei's head that we wouldn't be able to see from Yoni's perspective? Oh, well, that sounds like a great question. Let's write that one down. Why does the story need to be in Sergei's point of view at this point? What is it about this part of the story that needs to be told in Sergei's point of view rather than Yoni's? What's the impact of that? Okay. Oh, and then I also remember when we were thinking about this sentence, we were also thinking about how sudden the switch was. So it might be important to ask, what's the impact of this sudden switch? What kind of effect does that have on us, the reader? So we might even add another sentence like, how does this sudden switch in point of view impact the flow of the story? So what sort of impact does it have on how we read this? Okay, those sentences have a lot of stuff to actually dig into here. That's good. Let's take a look at another note. What's this one? Okay, this was our definition of KGB. I don't think we have any questions to ask about this. I'm kind of thinking coming back to this one right here, especially when those strangers are asking him questions. So one of the notes that we made on this was that this was an incomplete sentence. And I noticed that as we were reading this paragraph, we didn't have a lot of figurative language. There were no similes or metaphors or things like that. It was pretty straightforward. And the only really interesting structural thing that's happening other than the point of view switch is this incomplete sentence, which doesn't fit in with any of the other sentences around them. And part of me is wondering, because this is the second sentence that we get from inside of Sergei's head, what this incomplete sentence does to our impression of him. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting question to explore. So how does maybe grammar play into Sergei's role? And it kind of makes me wonder, it makes me want to discuss whether we find more incomplete sentences in Sergei's perspective and whether we see the same thing in Yoni's perspective. Oh, that sounds like a great question. So let's see. How does this grammatically incorrect sentence impact our first impression of Sergei? That one sounds like a good question. And then the other one that I thought about was, does Yoni also have grammar issues in his point of view, or is this only something that occurs in Sergei's point of view? Now that one's a little bit of a lower level question, but I feel like if I asked that in a group, it would prompt some really good analysis. Okay, great. So we've kind of gone through and asked a couple of questions. The last thing that we would do then is maybe just start thinking about, hey, what are my own interpretations of what these questions might ask? So let's take another look at that one we just asked, which was about the grammatically incorrect sentences. We don't want to just leave a question. We also want to have something to bring to the group, like an interpretation to discuss. So in my mind, it makes me wonder if one interpretation of this is maybe that Sergei isn't as smart as Yoni. I wonder if maybe that's a correct interpretation, or if this shows already his language gap even before he meets Yoni. Okay, So those are our steps when we're looking at close reading. Make sure you follow each of them because all of them are super important.